David Walsh pressed his palm against his chest, fingers tracing the familiar ridge of scar tissue that ran 3 inches below his left collarbone. The nightmare had returned with vengeance, pulling him from sleep at exactly 3:17 a.m. for the 4th time this week. In his dreams, shadows with impossibly long fingers moved around a child's bed, while whispers in an unknown language filled the air like static from a broken radio. Another romantic evening with your subconscious. Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the comm system as David stumbled into the Mars Research Station's main laboratory, clutching a steaming cup of synthetic coffee that tasted like burnt regret. At least my subconscious doesn't snore like a malfunctioning atmospheric processor, David replied, managing a weak smile as he pulled up the previous day's excavation data on his workstation. The holographic displays painted his face in ethereal blue light, casting sharp shadows across the scar that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm in the early morning stillness. Their research station perched on the rim of Vol's Mariner wrist like a metallic spider, its solar collectors already tracking the pale Martian sunrise. For 8 months, David's team had been methodically excavating what satellite surveys suggested were artificial structures buried beneath millennia of dust storms. The xenoarchaeology grant from the Colonial Science Foundation had seemed like a career-defining opportunity, though David privately suspected they'd find nothing more exciting than unusual rock formations and the fossilized remains of microscopic life. Hey, at least when I snore, I'm contributing to the atmospheric pressure readings, Sarah shot back, her fingers dancing across her own control panel. Speaking of which, the deep scan results from Sector 7 are, well, they're weird. David's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. After months of analyzing every pebble and dust grain with scientific precision, weird had become their holy grail. Define weird in terms that won't get us laughed out of the next peer review. Sarah's workstation projected a 3-dimensional map of their excavation site, with sensor data creating a ghostly outline of structures buried 20 meters below the surface. The density readings don't match anything in our geological database. It's like someone buried a crystal cathedral down there. Except crystals don't typically arrange themselves in geometric patterns that follow mathematical sequences we haven't discovered yet. The synthetic coffee suddenly tasted even worse. David set down his cup and moved to Sarah's station, studying the impossible architecture revealed by their ground-penetrating radar. Spires and chambers formed intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow even in the static holographic display, as if the structures were designed by minds that understood space in fundamentally different ways. Maybe the ancient Martians were really into avant-garde interior design, David said, though his attempt at humor fell flat even to his own ears. The scar on his chest had begun to itch, a phenomenon that always preceded his worst nightmares. How deep do we need to go to reach the main structure? About 15 meters, assuming our boring equipment doesn't decide to take a vacation like it did last month. Sarah expanded the hologram, revealing what appeared to be a central chamber surrounded by smaller rooms connected by corridors that curved in ways that made David's eyes water. I've run the math 3 times, and unless Martian physics worked differently a million years ago, these passages should intersect with themselves. It's like looking at a 3-dimensional Möbius strip. David's hand unconsciously moved to his scar again. The tissue felt warm beneath his fingers, warmer than it had any right to be in the climate-controlled environment of their research station. Let's start with the central chamber. If we're going to find answers, they'll be there. The next 6 hours passed in the familiar rhythm of archaeological excavation, though their tools would have seemed like magic to previous generations of researchers. Molecular disintegration fields carefully vaporized layers of sediment, while preservation fields protected any artifacts from damage. David worked with methodical precision, but his mind kept wandering to the dreams that had haunted him since childhood. The nightmares always followed the same pattern. He was 7 years old again, lying in a hospital bed while tall figures moved around him in surgical masks and gowns. But their hands were wrong, too long and too thin, and their eyes reflected light like mirrors. They spoke in musical whispers that his sleeping mind couldn't quite remember upon waking, though the melodies lingered like half-forgotten songs. His adoptive parents had always told him the scar came from emergency appendix surgery. But David had studied enough anatomy to know that appendix scars didn't appear on the chest. Still, medical records from his childhood had been lost in the great database crash of 2157, and questioning the only parents he'd ever known seemed ungrateful. "David, you need to see this." Sarah's voice cut through his reverie with an edge of excitement that made him look up from his excavation grid. She stood at the edge of their dig site, her helmet's headlamp illuminating something that gleamed with inner light in the Martian soil. David made his way carefully across the excavation platform, his boots' magnetic clamps adjusting automatically to the reduced gravity. What Sarah had uncovered defied immediate categorization: a crystalline structure about the size of a human torso, its surface covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. The crystal wasn't transparent like quartz or cloudy like most minerals. Instead, it held depths that suggested vast spaces compressed into impossible geometry. "Any idea what it is?" David asked, though he suspected Sarah was as mystified as he was. "Well, it's definitely not a rock," she said, running her scanner over the artifact. "The molecular structure is, let's call it creative. It's like someone took the periodic table and decided to improvise a jazz solo with the elements." David knelt beside the crystal, and immediately the itching in his scar intensified to a burning sensation that made him gasp. "Are you getting any energy readings?" Sarah's scanner began emitting a series of increasingly frantic beeps. "It's starting to show activity. Whatever this thing is, it's responding to something in our immediate environment." She looked at David with concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The burning sensation in David's chest had spread to his entire torso, and he could swear he heard faint music coming from the crystal, the same haunting melodies from his dreams. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his bare hand on the artifact's surface. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The crystal blazed with light that somehow didn't hurt their eyes, and holographic displays erupted around them in patterns of stunning complexity. Star maps filled the air, showing constellations David didn't recognize connected by streams of data that flowed like rivers of liquid light. Mathematical equations appeared and dissolved, replaced by symbols that looked almost familiar, as if he'd seen them in half-remembered textbooks from a school he'd never attended. "David, what did you do?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she stood only a few feet from him. "I have no idea," David replied, his voice steadier than he felt. The burning in his scar had transformed into something else, a sensation of completion, as if a circuit had finally been closed after years of remaining open. "But I think we're about to find out." The holographic displays suddenly shifted, focusing on a single point of light that pulsed with steady rhythm. As they watched, the light began transmitting a signal into space, not the random electromagnetic noise of natural phenomena, but a structured communication filled with purpose and intelligence. "It's broadcasting," Sarah whispered, her scientific excitement warring with very reasonable fear. "Something we uncovered is sending a message to somewhere." David couldn't tear his gaze away from the pulsing light. Deep in his chest, his scar had begun to pulse in perfect synchronization with the alien beacon, and for the first time in 20 years, the nightmares made perfect sense. They weren't dreams at all, they were memories, waiting for the right moment to surface. "I think," he said slowly, watching the signal disappear into the star-filled Martian sky, "we just told someone we're here." 3 weeks had passed since the crystal's signal disappeared into the void, and David Walsh had developed an unhealthy relationship with the observation deck's main viewport. He spent hours staring at the star field beyond Mars, waiting for something that logic insisted would never come while his scarred chest whispered otherwise. The Colonial Science Foundation had responded to their discovery with predictable bureaucratic enthusiasm, dispatching a team of specialists who were currently arguing about mineral composition in the station's conference room, with the passion of sports fans debating ancient statistics. You know, if you keep pressing your face against that viewport, you're going to leave permanent nose prints, Sarah said, floating up beside him in the low-gravity observation lounge. She held two bulbs of coffee that smelled marginally better than their usual synthetic blend. The cleaning bots are already filing complaints. David accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, though he didn't move away from the transparent aluminum barrier that separated them from the infinite darkness of space. Maybe I'm hoping that if I stare hard enough, the universe will take pity on me and provide some answers. The universe is notoriously bad at customer service, Sarah replied, settling into the nearby observation chair with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years adapting to variable gravity conditions. Though I have to admit, watching you develop separation anxiety with empty space has been entertaining. Dr. Morrison asked if you'd been replaced by a particularly obsessive android. The mention of their colleague's name made David grimace. Dr. Morrison had arrived with the specialist team and immediately begun treating their discovery like a particularly interesting geological sample, complete with theories about natural crystal formation that ignored the mathematical impossibilities they documented. Morrison thinks the holographic displays were some kind of optical illusion caused by atmospheric distortion. Morrison thinks anything he can't explain with a textbook from 2150 is probably a hallucination, Sarah said, taking a sip of her coffee and making a face that suggested the improvement in taste was relative. Last week he tried to convince me that the quantum resonance readings were equipment malfunction, because they didn't match his preconceived notions about ancient Martian mineralogy. David was about to respond when the station's proximity alarms began their distinctive three-note warning sequence that indicated something was approaching their orbital space. Both researchers looked at each other with the mixture of excitement and concern that came from months of routine, punctuated by the occasional supply ship or scientific delegation. Probably another transport full of experts who want to explain why our impossible discovery is actually quite mundane, David said, but he was already moving toward the communications console. The proximity sensors showed something that made him stop mid-motion and stare at the readout in disbelief. The approaching object measured nearly 200 meters in length, sleek and elegant in a way that human spacecraft never managed. Its hull seemed to shimmer with internal light, and it moved through space with fluid grace that suggested technology far beyond anything in Earth's colonial fleet. Most impossibly, it wasn't broadcasting any identification signals or communication attempts. It simply appeared on their sensors like a silver fish surfacing in still water. "That's not one of ours," Sarah said, her voice tight with the controlled excitement of a scientist confronting the impossible. "The configuration doesn't match any human design in the database, and the energy signature is. Well, it's showing power outputs that should be impossible for something that size." David's scar had begun its familiar burning sensation, though this time the feeling wasn't unpleasant. Instead, it felt like recognition, as if his body was responding to something it had been waiting for without his conscious knowledge. "Can we get a visual on the approaching ship?" Sarah's fingers flew across the communications array, and the observation deck's main display activated to show external camera feeds. The alien vessel hung against the star field like a work of art, its hull covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the light of distant suns. Graceful spires extended from its central structure, and panels of some translucent material pulsed with soft light that cycled through colors David had never seen before. "It's beautiful, not just technology," Lyrale replied, her attention remaining focused on David with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see directly into his memories. A bridge between worlds, a translator of intent and understanding, and a beacon that has finally guided us back to one who was lost to us too young. David's mind reeled with implication that seemed too vast to process. Lost to you. I'm human. I was born on Earth. You were born human, Lyrale agreed, but you were chosen for something greater. The mark you carry contains our gift to your species, the ability to understand and communicate across the barriers that separate thinking beings throughout the galaxy. We gave it to you when you were very young, during what your people would call a medical emergency, though the crisis provided us with the opportunity to offer our assistance. The surgery when I was 7, David whispered, pieces of his fractured memories beginning to assemble into patterns that made terrible and wonderful sense. Not surgery as your people understand it, Lyrale said gently. A gift freely given, though we had to wait until you were ready to understand its purpose. The beacon you activated has confirmed that the time has come for you to learn why you were chosen and what role you are meant to play in the greater community of worlds. Sarah stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming the strangeness of their situation. Greater community of worlds. Are you saying there's some kind of galactic civilization out there? Lyrale's smile broadened, and David could hear genuine warmth in her voice when she answered. Oh, Dr. Chen, there's so much more than you can imagine. Thousands of species, millions of worlds, all connected by bonds of cooperation and mutual understanding. Though I should warn you, the bureaucracy is somewhat more complex than your United Nations, and the lunch meetings tend to run long when you're dealing with species that have 12-hour digestive cycles. David had experienced many uncomfortable moments in his life, but floating through space in an alien transport pod, while Captain Lyrale explained the finer points of intergalactic politics, ranked somewhere near the top of the list. The pod's interior defied several laws of physics that David had considered non-negotiable, with walls that curved inward yet somehow provided more space than should have been geometrically possible. The key thing to understand about the Galactic Confederation, Lyrale was saying as she piloted their craft toward her ship with casual expertise, is that we've learned to embrace chaos as a fundamental organizing principle. When you have species that communicate through interpretive dance, beings made of living crystal who consider time optional, and entire civilizations that exist primarily as mathematical equations, traditional bureaucracy becomes somewhat inadequate. Sarah pressed her face against the pod's transparent barrier, watching the Starweaver grow larger as they approached. How do you even hold meetings with mathematical equations? Very carefully and with excellent translators, Lyrale replied. Though I should mention that the theoretical collective tends to get offended if you try to solve them during negotiations. They consider it rude. David's scar had stopped burning and now felt warm in a way that reminded him of sitting in summer sunlight. The sensation was oddly comforting, as if his body was finally remembering how to function properly after years of incomplete operation. How many species are we talking about exactly? Active members. About 47,000, though the number fluctuates depending on whether the hive minds are feeling social, or if the phase shifters have remembered to exist in our dimensional framework this century. Lyrale guided their transport into what appeared to be a docking bay that extended from the Starweaver's hull like a flower opening to receive them. Don't worry about memorizing everyone's names initially. We have excellent databases, and most species are understanding about pronunciation difficulties. The docking process completed with a soft vibration that David felt in his bones, and suddenly they were standing in a chamber that seemed to be made of living light. The walls pulsed gently with patterns that reminded David of breathing, and the air held a faint scent of ozone and something floral that he couldn't identify. Welcome aboard the Starweaver, Lyrale said, gesturing around them with obvious pride. "She's been my home for the better part of 3 centuries, though we've made some modifications for human comfort during your visit." 3 centuries? Sarah asked faintly. "How old are you exactly?" "By your counting system, somewhere around 800 years, though my people age differently than humans." Lyreley led them through corridors that seemed to shift and adapt around their presence, walls becoming transparent to reveal gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in vacuum. "We mature quickly but remain stable for extended periods. It's quite practical for interstellar travel, though it makes birthday parties somewhat tedious." They passed through several chambers that defied David's understanding of architecture and engineering. One room contained what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the galaxy, with points of light representing star systems connected by streams of energy that flowed like rivers. Another held beings that Lyreley introduced casually as crew members, though David wasn't sure how to categorize creatures that seemed to be made of liquid starlight or geometric patterns that moved with conscious purpose. "The tall crystalline fellow is resonance of distant thunder," Lyreley explained as they passed a being that looked like a walking cathedral made of singing crystal. "He's our chief engineer, though don't let his appearance fool you. He tells excellent jokes, assuming you can understand harmonics in 17 dimensions." "How do you shake hands with someone made of crystal?" David asked, genuinely curious about the practical aspects of interspecies interaction. "Very carefully, and only after asking permission. Thunder considers physical contact a form of musical collaboration, so handshakes tend to become impromptu concerts." Lyreley stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall, though it dissolved at their approach to reveal a chamber beyond. "This is what you might call our cultural exchange center, though we prefer to think of it as controlled chaos management." The room they entered was vast beyond the physical limitations of the ship that contained it, filled with displays and interfaces that represented technologies from across the galaxy. David saw screens showing worlds where cities floated in clouds of perpetual storm, oceans where entire civilizations existed as patterns of bioluminescence, and star systems where planets had been restructured into geometric shapes that served purposes he couldn't begin to guess. "Every species brings their own approach to problem solving," Lyreley explained, moving to a central console that responded to her touch by displaying swirling patterns of information. "The architects reshape matter at the molecular level. The dream weavers manipulate reality through shared consciousness, and the eternal engineers build structures that exist across multiple timelines simultaneously." Sarah approached a display showing what appeared to be a planet-sized flower blooming in the vacuum of space. "What's that?" "The Gardner Collective's latest project. They're terraforming an entire solar system into a work of art that will be visible from neighboring galaxies." Lyreley's expression grew thoughtful. "It should be finished in about 50,000 years, assuming they don't get distracted by a particularly interesting variety of cosmic moss." David found himself drawn to a display showing Earth and its colonial territories, though the image included details that weren't present in any human database. Mars appeared to have structures beneath its surface that extended far deeper than their archaeological surveys had revealed, and several of Earth's moons showed energy signatures that suggested hidden installations. "You've been watching us for a long time," David said, and it wasn't a question. "Monitoring might be a better word. We've learned that species develop better when they're allowed to find their own path, but we keep track of promising individuals." Lyreley joined him at the Earth display, her expression becoming more serious. "Your people are at a crucial point in their development. The technology to reach other star systems, the wisdom to cooperate across cultural boundaries, the curiosity to ask questions about the universe rather than simply accepting limitations." "And if we fail the test?" Sarah asked, though David suspected she already knew the answer wouldn't be reassuring. "There is no test exactly, but there are. consequences to the choices species make when they discover they're not alone in the universe. Lyreley touched the console, and the display shifted to show star systems marked with symbols David didn't recognize. Some species become aggressive, trying to conquer their neighbors. Others become isolationist, closing themselves off from contact. A few destroy themselves rather than accept that their worldview was incomplete. What happens to those species? We help when we can, but we don't interfere with fundamental choices about development and interaction. The universe is large enough to contain many different approaches to existence, though some approaches tend to be self-limiting. Lyreley's tone carried sadness that spoke of experience with such situations. We prefer to work with species that choose cooperation and growth. David's attention was drawn to a section of the display that showed his own world, but with overlays of data that revealed patterns he'd never noticed. Trade routes between colonies, communication networks, population centers, all arranged in ways that suggest. Will it hurt? Sarah asked from her observer's position near the chamber's entrance. She'd insisted on witnessing the procedure despite Lyreley's warnings about sensory overflow for unmodified humans. Define hurt, Lyreley replied with a smile that didn't entirely hide her concern. He might experience temporary synesthesia, brief moments of existing in 17 dimensions simultaneously, and the sudden ability to understand the emotional content of quantum fluctuations. But no, it shouldn't be painful exactly. That's remarkably reassuring, David said dryly, though his nervousness was tempered by curiosity about what he was about to become. What happens if something goes wrong? Then you'll spend the next few days speaking exclusively in mathematical poetry, and we'll need to find you a nice, quiet planet where that's considered normal conversation. Lyreley's expression grew more serious as she completed her preparations. The technology in your chest has been integrating with your neural pathways since childhood, David. This isn't changing who you are. It's revealing who you've always been meant to become. The activation began as a sensation of warmth spreading outward from his scar, but within moments, David realized that warmth was completely inadequate to describe what was happening to him. His consciousness expanded in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and suddenly he could sense the thoughts and emotions of every being aboard the Starweaver. Resonance of distant thunder's crystalline contemplations felt like cathedral music in his mind, while the quantum entities that served as the ship's navigation system communicated through patterns of probability that somehow made perfect sense. How do you feel? Lyreley's voice reached him through layers of perception that included not just her words but her genuine concern for his well-being, her excitement at witnessing a successful activation, and her deeper hopes for what his transformation might mean for both their species. Like I've been trying to see the world through a keyhole my entire life, and someone just opened the door, David replied, amazed that he could still form coherent sentences while experiencing the thoughts of beings whose consciousness operated on principles that human language couldn't begin to describe. This is what you meant about understanding across species barriers. The full capabilities will develop over time, Lyreley explained, her satisfaction evident in harmonics that David could now perceive as clearly as her spoken words. For now, you're experiencing basic empathic resonance with compatible species. Eventually, you'll be able to facilitate communication between beings whose thought processes are so different that they can't even recognize each other as conscious. Sarah stepped closer, studying David with the fascination of a scientist observing a successful experiment. Can you understand what I'm thinking? David focused on his friend, and immediately sensed her mixture of wonder, concern, and excitement about the implications of what they'd discovered. But beneath those surface emotions, he detected something that surprised him, a deep sadness about being left behind while he embarked on adventures beyond anything she'd ever imagined. You're worried that I'm going to disappear into space and leave you stuck with paperwork and Dr. Morrison's theories about optical illusions, David said gently. but also excited about the scientific possibilities and slightly annoyed that I get to have the cool alien superpowers. That's disturbingly accurate, Sarah admitted, though I prefer to think of my concerns as rational caution about my research partner developing delusions of cosmic significance. Lyrale moved to stand directly in front of David, and when she placed her hand on his chest where the scar had marked him since childhood, the sensation was like completing a circuit that had been waiting decades to close. The burning that had plagued him through nightmares and restless nights finally settled into something that felt like coming home. "We gave this to you long ago," she said, her words carrying the weight of recognition and promise that had echoed through his dreams for 20 years. "A gift freely offered when you needed healing, and a bridge that would one day connect your people to the greater community of consciousness that spans the galaxy." The touch triggered a cascade of memories that had been sealed away since childhood, not the confused fragments of nightmare, but clear recollections of beings who had saved his life when human medicine failed, who had seen potential in a dying child, and offered hope in the form of technology beyond his species' understanding. "I wasn't supposed to remember until now," David said, the realization carrying both relief and wonder. "You blocked the memories so I could grow up human, develop normally, form connections to my own kind before learning about my larger purpose." A child who knew he was different might have become isolated from his own species, Lyrale confirmed. "We needed you to understand humanity from the inside, to love your people enough to serve as their advocate rather than their replacement." David stood, feeling the new capabilities settling into his consciousness like instruments in an orchestra finding their proper harmony. He could sense the vast network of communication that connected worlds across the galaxy, feel the ebb and flow of interspecies cooperation that maintained peace among beings whose very existence challenged each other's fundamental assumptions about reality. "What happens to Earth now?" Sarah asked, though David could sense that her question carried deeper concerns about humanity's readiness for contact with advanced civilizations. "That depends largely on David," Lyrale replied, turning to include both humans in her response. "The Confederation doesn't impose membership on developing species, but we do offer guidance and support for those who choose to join us. David's role will be to help his people understand what membership means and decide whether humanity is ready to accept the responsibilities that come with galactic citizenship." "Responsibilities like what?" David asked, though through his expanded awareness, he was already beginning to understand the complexity of maintaining peace among species, whose definitions of existence, consciousness, and reality differed in fundamental ways. "Protecting younger species from exploitation, contributing resources and knowledge to collective projects, accepting refugees from worlds facing extinction, mediating disputes between civilizations whose conflicts might otherwise destroy entire star systems." Lyrale's expression grew thoughtful. "It's not always easy work, but it's meaningful in ways that transcend individual species' concerns." David felt the weight of choice settling around him like a mantle he'd been unconsciously preparing to wear his entire life. Through the neural interface, he could sense the hopes and fears of beings across the galaxy, species that had joined the Confederation and found purposes beyond their wildest dreams, others that had chosen isolation and slowly withered in their self-imposed limitations. "And if I say no, if I decide humanity isn't ready, then we respect that choice and wait,"